Hi everyone, welcome back to Richmond Public Library Presents Young Writers Workshop. I'm Mr. Lewis from the Ginter Park Library, and today we're going to be talking about editing. That is, polishing your work until you get your finished result, going back and revising. So in this video, we're going to be covering the differences between editing and proofreading, which might sound similar at first, and they are similar, but there is a very specific difference between the two, and we'll go over that. We'll go over the editing process, including the multiple steps that are there, and we'll talk about getting help when it comes to the editing process. So first, let's talk about the differences between editing and proofreading. They are both very similar topics, like I said, but they are very different. All right, so editing is more about the content of your writing. So it's about the story, it's about the characters, it's about the plot, right? And this is about filling in plot holes. If you notice there's a plot hole in your story, you need to work to fill it in during the editing process. All right, we'll talk a little bit more about this in a little bit. It's also checking for the small details, making sure that you are consistent throughout your story, making sure the small details are correct. It's easy to get lost in the big details when it comes to a large story, so it's important to make sure you focus on getting the small details correct as well. And it's about trimming for content and length. All right. When I say trimming, I mean actually cutting out whole sections of your story. Sometimes it could just be a couple words, sometimes it could be a sentence, paragraph, it could be entire chapters, depending on how the editing process goes. Proofreading, though, is all about the grammar. Is your work technically correct? So it's things like the spelling of words, the correct punctuation, and the overall readability of your work, right? Does it make sense in a grammar fashion? So is it technically correct? We'll go over proofreading in another video because it's actually a much larger topic than it seems just from this. There's a lot that goes into it, and I don't really have time to cover it, both of these topics today. Editing is going to be a long enough video as it is, as we'll see. So let's talk about editing in general. Editing is the process by which you go back and review and revise your work. Now, it can be done at any point. You don't have to wait until the very end, although it is generally preferable to have at least your first rough draft finished before you get into the heavy editing. You can go back and change like a couple sentences here and there as you're working if you want, but for the major editing, it's always best to have the full rough draft finished because you never know what might change. You might be working on a couple chapters and then you are editing them as you go and you're like, okay, this is perfect. And then you move on to the next chapter and something comes up and you have to completely rewrite those first chapters again, and you've kind of wasted that time. So it's always best to do it after your first rough draft is finished, and then you'll have multiple drafts. When we say rough draft, that's always the first draft, but it's not the last draft. You will have many drafts, many versions of your story as you go along. So the first major editing will come after the rough draft is finished. So these are the things you're going to check for. There's a lot more, and things are a lot more complex than I'm going to be discussing them. But I'm just giving you the overall basics here, and it's enough to get started. But there is a lot of resources out there that can help you go more in depth with all of these topics. So the 5 things to mainly focus on are consistency. Does your story stay consistent throughout? Are the characters the same? Are the settings the same? If you make a statement in chapter 1, is that statement still true in the last chapter? Okay, you have to be consistent. You can't just change things up at the last second or whenever you feel like it. Plot holes. If there's a big gap in logic, you need to be able to work around it, fill it in, or do something with it. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Story order. This is just the order in which your story is told. Generally, that's chronologically, but it doesn't have to be. So during the editing process, sometimes you'll find that you will move scenes around, both in the way you're telling it or in the actual story itself. Sometimes you'll tell a story out of order, or sometimes you'll have a scene that you originally had taking place at one moment in your story, and you realize that you need to move it to a different point in your story. Length. the overall length of your story. It might seem like longer is better. That is not the case. If a story goes too long, unless it has a good reason to, then readers are not going to want to read it. And interest. Is your story interesting? There's a lot that goes into that, but it's definitely something that is brought up during the editing process. So let's talk about consistency. And when it comes to consistency, there's one basic question you need to ask. Is all the established information the same throughout your story? When you set something up in your world, that the world works in a certain way, you need to maintain that throughout the story, right? Does your world make sense, generally speaking, all right? Now, if the world your story takes place in is too confusing, some readers will just lose interest, all right? If your world is not set in the real world, then you have to establish how your world is different from the real world. And if it is confusing, if it is too vague, if it is just too inconsistent, you will lose readers because it's just too much. The world doesn't make sense. They don't have a good frame of reference for the way the world works. You have to establish how your world works, and it can't be too confusing. You can have a big world. You can have a big system in your world. If you're writing a fantasy, you can have a big magic system, and it can make sense to you, and you don't have to outline every single specific thing. But it does have to make sense within its own context, right? So if you have rules, you have to follow those rules. Even in real world series, though, your world has to make sense because your story takes place in its own reality. Even that reality is meant to be the same as, the actual real world, there are still situations that are exclusive to your story. So your world has to make sense and it has to be consistent, all right? So does your story follow its own rules? When you create a world, especially if it's a fantasy or sci-fi world where it's not exactly like the real world, you set up your own rules. And your story has to follow them because readers will know if you don't. One of the biggest complaints about books like the Harry Potter series is that the magic system is inconsistent. Things change all the time, book to book, and it's confusing, and it's obvious. And that's a big problem. Now, Harry Potter can get away with it because the rest of it is still very enjoyable, but there are plenty of books out there that failed because they didn't follow their own rules. So it's important that you follow your own rules unless there's a reason for it. But you have to give that reason at some point. It doesn't have to be up front. If you have a situation where one of your established rules are broken, you have to explain how they were able to be broken. Next, let's talk about plot holes. Now, plot holes are basically where your story has a gap in logic, or just when something straight up doesn't make sense. When there's an issue with your story where if you think of something logically, the story would not progress the way you write it. Because in the real world, people would say, what about this? Or what about that? Why don't we do this? Or you have an event where the effects of that event are not the way they would be in a common sense situation. Now, sometimes those things that just can be explained away, but that's something that you, the author, have to do. Okay, you can explain plot holes. That's what filling in the plot holes are, right? It's explaining why that gap exists. Okay, filling in the plot holes. All right. Now, plot holes can be issues of commission or omission. Now, what I mean by that is it can be something that you add, which makes the story somehow a little more shaky. If you add something, you can say, wait, that doesn't make sense, right? Or you can not add something, all right? Omission. You can forget to add something, or you can just leave something out that is very important to making the story make sense. So if you forget something, if you don't have a certain section that is important, that would be a omission, all right, a plot hole that is caused by omission. Now, it's okay to have apparent plot holes as long as they're resolved by the end. What I mean by that is if you, throughout your story, you can have certain points where the reader might say, why did that happen? Or that doesn't make sense. That's okay as long as you resolve it, as long as you fill in those gaps by the end of the story. I mean, that's basically what a mystery is when you think about it. It's a series of situations that don't make sense until they do, right? So throughout your story, it's okay to have plot holes. Just make sure that you fill them in by the time you get to the end of the story, because readers will know if you don't. Also, sometimes you'll find a plot hole, and that plot hole can become an opportunity that you didn't realize that you had. Maybe you had a character that you just couldn't really fit in any other way, but then you go back to your editing while you're editing, and you see that there's a situation that doesn't make sense, but if you add that character you wanted, now it can make sense. So some plot holes can become opportunity. But be careful, because this can backfire. All right? If you find a plot hole and you think, aha, I can do something with this, it might either spiral out of control or it might not work out exactly the way you want. So be careful. So plot holes, just make sure if you find them, you fill them in. You explain them, you find some way to make them work. So next, let's talk about story order. This is the way your story unfolds, the logical progression. Not all stories need to be told chronologically, as in the events don't have to take place along a set timeline. All right, you can jump around. This is especially true if your story has multiple viewpoints. So if you have more than one main character and you jump from one character's perspective to a different character's perspective between chapters, then it not only is possible, but it actually makes a lot of sense to jump around the story chronologically. You can tell the same time period in two different chapters just from different points of view. Or you can jump forwards and backwards in time depending on how things go. So while you're editing, it's important to keep the story order in mind and how your story plays out, because it's important that your story flows logically. Logically is more important than chronologically, which is funny to say it that way, but it makes sense when you really think about it, okay? Story makes sense as you read it, then it doesn't matter if it's not told in the proper order, right? So if you're working on a twist or a big reveal especially, how much information you give and when you give it is key to making the twist work, okay? So sometimes you will move scenes from one section to another to make a twist or a big reveal work, or just to make things flow more logically. So keep that in mind when you're editing your story, that you might move scenes from one place to another chronologically, depending on where it fits in the story logically. So now let's talk about the big one, length. When you're editing for length, this is going to be one of the biggest portions of your editing process, because there's so much that goes into it. When you're editing for length, be aware and beware of bloat. Bloat is just more than you need. Information that is so much more than you need, right? It's just extra. It's fluff, sometimes they call it. It's just more than is necessary, right? So as you're editing, ask yourself, does the reader need to know this? Because if the answer is no, then you should seriously consider taking out that section or that sentence or that word or that description or whatever. Because if you include too much information that is not actually important or pertinent or related to the plot in any way, then it's just bloat. It's just extra information that is not needed. All right? Storytelling is about the story, not the world that the story takes place in, right? And it's hard because you spend so much time building that world for yourself so that you have a place for the story to take place in, and you want to share that. But that's not why the reader is there. The reader is there for the story. So while you're editing, check for bloat. check for information that is not needed, that might be cool or interesting to you because you made the world that the story is taking place in, but in reality is not necessary, right? You can give background information, but the focus needs to stay on the story, right? One thing to keep in mind when it comes to editing for length is that it's easier to trim than it is to bulk. And what I mean by that is it's a lot easier to make a long story shorter than to make a short story longer. All right. Anyone who's been short on a school paper knows exactly what I'm talking about. It's a lot easier to reduce something to the required length than it is to expand something to the required length. All right, so it's better to overdo it than it is to underdo it. But be aware that if you overdo it, you still have to go back and fix it so that it's not too long. All right, so just be aware while you're editing your work what is important, and if there's anything you can kind of smooth the edges with. All right, take things out so that the story isn't this long wandering piece, but focused, tight, and tells the story that you want it to tell. So that leads us directly into interest, which in a lot of ways has the same purpose as the length one, and that is making sure that the focus is there to keep your reader's interest. Okay? The story needs to focus on the story, not anything else. Okay? So if what you're writing doesn't serve the narrative, it doesn't serve your story, is it worth keeping? This is a hard question because you spend a lot of time working on your story, and every word that you write is something that you've created yourself. So it's hard to get rid of that, right? This is something that authors call killing your darlings. And this is a difficult thing. Basically, it's something that you made that you personally really like. It could be a scene, it could be a character, it could be a quirk, like just a character trait. It could be really anything, but it's something that you like. But it doesn't actually help the story. So there are times during the editing process where you will have to kill your darling. You will have to remove something from your story that you personally really like, but you have to objectively admit doesn't serve any purpose. It's a difficult thing, but it is an important thing because you have to keep your story focused to maintain that interest, right? You have to keep the narrative tight, as they say. Focus on the story, not the extras, not the world, the story. So as you're editing, think about these things. There's a lot more to it than this, obviously, but this is the basics. All right. The key is focus on maintaining the story because the story comes first. All 5 of the things I've talked about, all right, they all lead to the same thing. You're telling a specific story, so it has to make sense and it has to work as a story. And anything that's extra doesn't belong. All right, and it's hard to get rid of, but it is important. So those are the basics of the editing process. And I understand that feels like a lot, because it is a lot. There's a lot that goes into the editing process. It's a difficult thing to do, and it takes skill. Not everyone can be a great editor. Even people who are good writers aren't necessarily going to be good editors. All right. So one thing I highly recommend is that you get help with editing because you have biases. That means that if something makes sense to you, it might not make sense to somebody else. All right. If something sounds awesome and cool and works for you, it might not work for somebody else. All right. Now, there are ways around this. Taking breaks from your work, stepping away from it for a day or two, and just kind of clearing your head and then going back gives you a fresh perspective on it. But even then, it's still your work. So you have a very specific perspective. So it helps to have other people look at your work. Fresh eyes help immensely, all right? Because they don't have those biases that you do. They don't have the whole story. They only see what you have given them. And that's very important. Okay? Having friends read your work will help you understand how readable that work is and if it makes logical sense. It is a lot easier for other people to point out plot holes than it is to find plot holes yourself. Okay? Because you know the entire story. You know how everything works. But somebody else only sees what you have given them. So if you haven't given them enough and there's a plot hole there, they will know it, even if you don't, because you might not recognize it because you say, oh, well, I know why that happens. But somebody else who has read it says, I don't know why that happens because you haven't explained it to them. Okay? So having another person look at your work is a big help. All right? Feedback from others is one of the best sources of advice when it comes to editing. There's a reason professional authors have professional editors look at their work. It's not that they can't do the editing themselves, it's that they have people who are specifically trained and who are very good at their job to look over that work because they need that extra input. Right? It is a skill to edit. So where can you find extra help? Well, if you have friends, ask friends. People who are willing to help you with that, absolutely do that. But there are other places you can go. If you are able to go to like a school group, there are school groups who will sometimes help you out with it. If you are able to go online, there are plenty of online forums where people are willing to help aspiring authors. In fact, the Young Writers Workshop itself has a Discord channel specifically so that people can talk about writing and actually help each other with the editing process. So that about wraps it up for this video. I hope you found the information helpful, and I hope I didn't scare you off because it's a big topic, and there's a lot more that goes into editing than even that I talked about here. It's a long process, and like I said, it's a real skill, but this is a good start for it. So whether you're editing your own work or you're helping somebody else edit their work, I hope these things are useful to you. And remember, however you decide to write, just write. Thank you all so much for joining me. I'll see you next time.